I'm halfway through this enormous apocalyptic supernatural thriller by Stephen King, and it's got me reflecting on how I got here, because a year ago the idea of reading a book like this would terrify me on so many levels. Sci-fi, fantasy, dystopian was definitely not my jam, and I thought it'd be fun to talk about the books that brought me to this one and share any pearls of wisdom that I learned along the way. Hello friends, welcome to Recovering Book Snob. My name is Chloe. On this channel we learn to love reading again, without the frills, without the academic pressure. I'm usually a literary fiction kind of gal, but I've been exploring a lot of different genres recently, and in this video we're going to be talking about sci-fi, fantasy, dystopian, probably my most out of reach scary genres until recently. This all started with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which some people describe as the original sci-fi. If you don't know, somehow, Frankenstein is about a scientist who creates a monster and then is like, oh my god, I've created a monster, how awful, abandons the monster. And the book's about their relationship, about how they haunt each other, the search for belonging, society rejecting something or someone that doesn't fit their rules. And although this book isn't one of my all-time favourites, I did learn a very important lesson. In fact, I learned my first lesson about the sci-fi, fantasy, dystopia genre, which is these books are not always tales of worlds that are meant to ignite the imagination but don't necessarily have loads going on underneath. And it's not like I'd written the genre off for that reason entirely. I knew there would be some substance in there, but reading Frankenstein really made me appreciate how these quite odd, very imaginative stories are actually really good devices and really good commentary. It was very cool for the first time seeing it in action, especially with Frankenstein. A lot of it is about abandonment and parent-child relationships, and if you haven't read it, it sounds weird that that's what it's about, but those are some of the really strong themes. And having a bit more to play with and having the author break the bounds of science and the bounds of what we think to be true in the real world is a really cool way of letting you flex like right at the edges and explore the edge cases and the extremes of this kind of stuff. The next book I read, and this book I read because I saw it all over TikTok, I must admit, was Bunny. I later read Rouge by the same author. Both of these books are fantasy slash gothic fairy tale. Again, a genre that I had not read at all, and I was very skeptical. I did not think I would enjoy either of these. Well, once I'd read Bunny and I realised I really enjoyed it, I thought I might enjoy Rouge, but I really wasn't sure whether I'd enjoy Bunny that much. Especially, it's quite divisive. Bunny is about a master's student who is on a very prestigious, hard to get into English writing, creative writing course, and her classmates, the class is quite small, and it's basically just her and then this group of girls who are seem quite up themselves. They all call each other Bunny. They're very cutesy, they're very cliquey. Our protagonist is definitely an outsider until she's invited to join in on one of their gatherings. The story is definitely a down the rabbit hole, Alice in Wonderland type feeling. The really cool thing about this, and the lesson I learned here and the appreciation that I found, was the questioning your own reality feeling and the unreliable narrator. With Bunny in particular, so many odd things happen. It's probably still up for debate as to whether it's fantasy or not, because you could argue that a lot of the things that happen in this book are hallucinations or they're meant to be not real. But that's what I think's so cool about it as a writer. It's quite hard to get it right. This going down the rabbit hole, like slightly insane point of view is really hard to keep a hold on and to not lose your audience when you're writing it. But Bunny definitely kept me interested and was my first experience of that type of thing, where you're reading and you almost feel like you're hallucinating because the story is darting around and your brain is really struggling to grip on to reality and to grip on to what's real. The Seven Moons of Marley Almeida. This one was a really fun one. I picked it up very randomly. I listened to it as an audiobook from my local library and I wasn't sure what to expect at all. It's actually fantasy magical realism and it was pretty confusing at first, and you'll understand when I explain the plot. It's about Marley Almeida, who has died, and he finds himself in some kind of admin style office talking to the person behind the desk. He's died and he was murdered and he needs to work out how to get to the place beyond, the next life. But first he needs to work out who killed him. So I guess it's a kind of murder mystery, but from the point of view of the person who's been killed. It was a really, really fun angle, and it was also just a very interesting book overall. Marley Almeida is, or was, a photojournalist, and it's set during Sri Lanka's civil war. This one was just very wacky, and the cool thing here was that it had this really slightly uncomfortable at times layer of humour. It definitely kept me reading. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I yak on about this book. It's one of my favourite books of all time. Dystopian, set in a time where fertility has dropped massively. All the fertile women who aren't super wealthy get rounded up and are handmaids for wealthy families. They're basically a womb with limbs, or that's how they're treated, and the story is gruesome and terrifying and chilling, but again, a little bit humorous. I think I would describe this book as my first really challenging dystopian book that, you know, it really, really moved me, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about dystopian fantasy sci-fi being used for social commentary. This was a very strong one for that. I think because I'm classically a scaredy cat, and I still am a scaredy cat, but reading The Handmaid's Tale really solidified for me some books are worth it. Some books are worth the fear and the discomfort. Sorry, I think Matty's blending something in the other room. So after The Handmaid's Tale, which I just thought was extraordinary, I was ready immediately for another challenge, and I think it also coincided with the film release, and that is Dune. This was a really big one. As you can see, I hadn't really read much pure sci-fi. A lot of it was dystopian, which is a subgenre of sci-fi, but it wasn't, you know, spaceships, aliens. It was still quite rooted in reality. Dune is on another planet called Arrakis, and I read this because of the films, I'm gonna be honest. The films were coming out. It also was recommended, you know, it is one of the epic sci-fis that everyone says you have to read, so I think I would have read it eventually, but I probably wouldn't have got to it as fast if it wasn't for the films. And I think that is another pearl of wisdom. Sometimes you need to just shamelessly use a film to motivate you to read a book, especially if you're a little bit worried about a book being dry or missing certain meanings in a book. And it's also just a fun little experiment because you get to compare the book with what you watched, and trust me, there will be discrepancies. Dune was also a real challenge because it's very dry, not just because of the sand. I really, really liked it, but the first 100 pages definitely are very full of military tactics and all that jazz, and I know now, I didn't know at the time, but there are other sci-fi books where it spoon feeds you a little bit more. Dune really doesn't, and the world building, you have to learn it via conversations. The world building really isn't spoon fed, so you've got to be paying attention. You've got to have a lot of mental juice in the noggin to get you through, although that phrase does it a disservice because I did really enjoy the book. Numb legs. Lesson number, I haven't been counting the lessons, but another lesson, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel García Márquez. This book is magical realism. The lesson here was just that not every book has to be a mammoth big thick book to count. This book I think was 15 pages. I read quite a few of the other short stories. He's got quite a lot of little magical realism, weird little fantasy stories that are really powerful and interesting and have pretty thoughtful messaging. Next up, I was ready to indulge myself with another popular internet book that I see everywhere, and that is Babel. I really enjoyed Babel. Babel is historical fiction with fantasy objects. So it is fantasy, but it's based in the real world, and you just have an object that has magical powers. The object in Babel are these silver bars, and the story is about colonialism and belonging, and it's based in Oxford in the UK. I definitely think some people probably would even describe it as dark academia. It has a very strong atmosphere, and R.F. Kuang described it as a love letter and a breakup letter to Oxford, and I'm obsessed with that quote because reading it, you really feel that. The lesson here is just that you don't need to read the biggest and the scariest. Babel is a book that is very accessible. It's well written and it's intelligent, but it's not dry in the way that some others are, and it's super popular. So I think I would say just shamelessly choose the popular sci-fi fantasy books. Just do it. Just choose the ones that are more contemporary, choose the ones that you've seen loads of people enjoy, and don't listen to people who are like, oh, this isn't real fantasy, or like this doesn't count. It's like, just ignore and enjoy the book, you know? Next up we have A Love Song for Ricki Wilde. This is a romance / magical realism. I don't really love romance, so this book was a risky choice, and to be honest, it didn't really pay off. I didn't love it, but it was kind of interesting seeing such a serious genre bend in action. Romance with fantasy elements is quite an odd one. I think it's quite hard to execute. I find sometimes books like that struggle to really know where to draw the line, struggle to know when things should be realistic and when they shouldn't be. Similar to this, but a book that I really enjoyed, we have The Blind Assassin. The Blind Assassin is another Margaret Atwood book. I've been on a Margaret Atwood rampage recently, and it's in this list because there is a sci-fi element in it, but it's done in a really cool way. So classic Margaret Atwood, she is super ambitious with her writing, and this book is that. Like, I can't really describe the book because it's about so many different things, but it's so good. If you Google it, it describes it as a love story, and then the lovers meet up, but it's a sort of forbidden love story. And during their meetups, he's telling her about this sci-fi world, about a kind of plot within the plot. This was really confusing at first because I didn't realise this book had this sci-fi element, and obviously it doesn't make the book overall sci-fi genre, but the really cool thing about this is how that sci-fi story reflected the story going on in the book, because it was all about power and women having a really bad time and other things, but it was very interesting seeing how even the most nuanced little plot points and moments in the main plot had some kind of representation in the sci-fi story. It was really cool. Immediately after The Blind Assassin, I picked up Oryx and Crake, which I believe is quite a popular one of hers because it is the first of a series, and it's sci-fi, dystopian, post-apocalyptic. Loads of people have been wiped out by a plague, and you're following Snowman, who remains while he reflects on this woman that he loved and a friend and life before. I think it was this book that finally gave me the courage to pick up The Stand, because I was like, I can handle the death and the terror. Looking back, and now that I'm halfway through reading The Stand, I think that was a little bit optimistic. The Stand has a lot more active death and terror, because Oryx and Crake almost skips out the plague bit, or at least you just see it in patches, whereas The Stand takes you through the entire process from patient 0 to pretty much everyone's dead, and you read about that for the first 400-500 pages. So The Stand has been tough, I'm not gonna lie. But before we get there, I read some fantasy / paranormal books. Ninth House was quite an interesting contemporary paranormal, all about power and class. It's about Alex Stern, who is picked up by Yale in mysterious circumstances. Like, she's not an overachiever, she's definitely an underachiever actually, and she is found in a crime scene, wakes up in hospital, mysterious Yale person comes to her bed and is like, we need you, you'll be really good for the job. And so she goes to Yale, really doesn't fit in, and helps them out because these things come at a price. I found the Alex character very endearing. She's kind of one of those rough around the edges but with a secret golden heart type characters, and the story overall was just a lot of fun. I'd read the second one. The second one was a bit of a nosedive, I'm not gonna lie, but the first one was a fun little experience of paranormal. I don't think I'll be rushing back. I'm not that interested in paranormal type fantasy. I think, and you've probably seen this from my reading, I think as long as I have the stomach for it, dystopian sci-fi type stuff is probably the closest I'll get. And I definitely need to explore more mainstream sci-fi because I've gone down a dystopia road, but I'm having a good time for now. Finally, I read Weyward, which is about witches. The really cool thing about this book is that the magic is very closely linked to nature. I found that kind of beautiful. I didn't think I would care that much about that element, but I kind of loved the way it didn't fully feel like fantasy. The witchcraft in it is very heavily based on just having a real connection with nature and being very tuned into the world around you, and being able to communicate with animals, but it's not necessarily in a kind of cheesy, like you're literally yapping at them, but just in a kind of everyone knows what's going on kind of way. Anyway, my dinner is being served. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a lovely week. I hope you've had a lovely week. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.